All right, Jonathan, if you want to take the last minute and a half to respond to some of John Gleason's positions or rebuttals.
Oh, absolutely. Actually, I was ready to go into the cross-examination. Can we maybe just go into the cross-examination?
Yeah, we can just go there. Yeah, you're right. Yeah, we can just go there. All right, at this time, we go to cross-examination. It'll be a total of 60 minutes. First, starting with Jonathan McLatchie, cross-examining John Gleason for 10 minutes.
John, thanks for your statements. Would you concede that the author of Luke Acts believed that Jesus was a physical person who walked on earth?
I mean, with the consideration that 2 Gospels were written before him claiming so, and he was using those, I would say that the author of Luke's, whoever that might be, would probably consider Jesus to be a historical person.
Probably. You mean certainly?
No, I'm not going to say certainly. I'm going to say probably, because I don't, like, as far as history goes, I don't really deal with certainties. Like, I'm not 100% certain or anything like that. I say probably just because that's the most probable, explanation.
But you would acknowledge that the evidence is overwhelming that Luke thought Jesus was a physical person who walked on earth, right?
Sure.
Yeah. And if hypothetically Luke was a traveling companion of Paul, that would disintegrate Carrier's thesis, would it not?
If Luke was a traveling companion of Paul, I don't think that would necessarily, because a lot of Luke's teachings kind of contradict what Paul writes about. Like,
okay, no, that's a separate question. So we can debate whether Luke really was a traveling companion of Paul, but if he was, then it would be very surprising for Luke to think Jesus was a historical person who walked on earth and Paul to have thought otherwise.
I think that if Luke, the person that we're calling Luke, actually was a traveling companion of Paul, I think that we would find Luke being written much earlier than we actually do.
I mean, Luke, I think, is very early. I mean, I would place the Gospel of Luke in the 50s.
Why would you do that?
Well, I'm non-committal on it because I don't think it's hugely important. I certainly don't think it's as late as Carrier and yourself want to date it to the 90s. But I mean, part of the reason for that is because I date Acts to the early 60s, and Luke obviously has to predate Acts. And also there's a reference to Luke in 1 Timothy 5:18, which I would date to the early 60s. And so that would push Luke back as well.
Wait a second. 1 Corinthians, hold on.
1 Timothy 5:18.
What?
1 Timothy 5:18.
Oh, 1 Timothy. That wasn't written by Paul. So yeah.
So I actually think it was. So that's going to be a bone of contention between us, I think.
Well, yeah, we're going to have to fundamentally disagree on that, because if I remember correctly, you think that all of the epistles that are attributed to Paul were actually written by Paul. Whereas that's clearly been shown. And you keep throwing around Richard Carrier's name, which I do draw a lot of my information off of Carrier, but that is not my only source for any of my ideas. Bart Ehrman, I use him for a lot of my sourcing material. Ed Helms is another person. Robert Price is another person. Earl Doherty. I mean, Raphael Lataster. There's a multitude of different people out there that espouse the exact same things.
Well, there's different flavors of mythicism, and Richard Carrier's approach is rather different from Price's, etc. But getting back to the question, So if Luke was Richard Carrier even conceded this in his debate with me, that if Luke really was a traveling companion of Paul, his argument is in serious hot water, because Luke clearly believed that Jesus was a physical person who walked on earth, right?
Well, yeah, but I don't think that speculating about Luke being a traveling companion of Paul.
It's not speculation, it's overwhelming evidence for it.
Gets us anywhere.
It's not speculation, it's overwhelming evidence.
I don't think that there is overwhelming evidence, because, good.
I mean, for example, the we passages starting from Acts 16, I think are strong evidence that Luke claims to be a traveling companion of Paul. So then we can go and evaluate whether he's actually credible in that claim. In Acts 16, actually, the we passages trail off when they're in Philippi, and then you don't find any more we passages until chapter 20, when they start again when Paul goes back to Philippi, which Craig Keener in his 4-volume commentary on Acts, in the first volume, he makes a cumulative case for taking the weak passages at face value, and that one of the arguments that he makes is that that's exactly the sort of pattern you would expect if Luke, the author, had remained in Philippi and had regrouped with Paul when Paul had gone back through Philippi in chapter 20.
Well, yeah, but I mean, if you come at it from the perspective of Acts being historical fiction, like I believe it's Michael Purvo.
Richard Purvo. He's a crank, frankly. Yeah, I mean, Richard Purvo and Richard Carrier are both really in a limb when it comes to the Book of Acts.
Okay. The fact of the matter is, though, is that Acts and Luke both pull from sources that only occur much later in the timeline.
No, I don't think that Acts is drawing on Josephus. I think that they're both historians who wrote about. I think they're both contemporaries of each other. And let's just take an example that I think shows just the credibility of Acts. So consider. So this is an example of an undesigned coincidence pertaining to Acts. So in 1 Corinthians 4. So Paul is writing the epistle of 1 Corinthians from Ephesus to the Corinthian Christians, and Ephesus is in Asia Minor and it's across the Aegean Sea from Corinth, which is the capital of Achaia, which we named it as Greece. And in 1 Corinthians 4, he mentions in verse 17, that's why I sent you Timothy, my beloved and faithful child in the Lord, to remind you of my ways in Christ. So at the time he's writing, in the early to mid-50s, to the Corinthians from Ephesus, he's already sent Timothy on his way to Corinth, according to that text. But then in chapter 16, he says, when Timothy comes, see that you put him ease among you. And so he thus, even though he has already sent Timothy on his way to the Corinthians, he nonetheless expects his letter to arrive in Corinth before Timothy gets there. So how do we put those little puzzle pieces together? Well, if you go over to Acts in chapter 19, when they're in Ephesus, which is when Paul's in Ephesus, verse 21 and 22, it says, after these events, Paul resolved in the Spirit to pass through Macedonia and Achaia and go to Jerusalem, saying, after I've been there, I must also see Rome. And having sent into Macedonia 2 of his helpers, Timothy and Erastus, he himself stayed in Asia for a while. So it correlates exactly with what you'd expect from those clues in 1 Corinthians in a way that points to the authorship of 1 Corinthians, which is not contested, and also points to the historicity of Acts in that particular instance. And there's dozens of those that corroborate Acts.
Well, okay, but I don't understand how you're exactly debunking my particular hypothesis, being that Acts was written much later, and so he was using Paul's writings and Mark's writings and all of that. Why is that?
So he was using.
Hold on. Why is your particular explanation more probable than the author of Luke just having access to Paul's writings and reconciling different things, or writing his narrative with that in mind? It just seems like he's writing it because he's writing it that way because he has access to that information.
Because these things are so subtle. In First Corinthians, in 1 Corinthians, these things are buried in 1 Corinthians 4 and 1 Corinthians 6 and 1 Corinthians 16. So it's not like that the author of 1 Corinthians is using Acts to insert those little details so far apart. And in Acts, there's no mention of even Corinth being the destination of Timothy. It's so casual and subtle. And so by far, the hypothesis that this actually happened is the simplest explanation of the evidence. But it's
simplest explanation, though, especially when you consider all of the evidence that places Acts and Luke Acts at the very end of the first century.
No, that's totally not true. I mean, I completely contest that the author of Luke was dependent on Josephus.
Okay, well, I mean, you can contest that, but there's a plethora of evidence that suggests differently. So, I mean, I guess that's just going to have to be a contention. Honestly, I don't think that the whole Acts attack, I guess, like using Acts in order to prove a historical Jesus, I really don't think that that's a very worthwhile thing go down, because there's much better evidence that we can discuss. Because obviously, I don't consider Acts to be written at the time that you consider Acts to be written, and I'm guessing that you consider all the Gospels and everything like that to be written much, much earlier than what the evidence actually suggests. At least in my
no, it's you that think that much later than the evidence actually suggests. But I'm non-committal on the actual date of the Gospels, because I think there's a lot of room for debate on the actual dating of the Gospels. But they're certainly written within the lifetime of the eyewitnesses. And I think that they're certainly based on the testimony of eyewitnesses and credible eyewitnesses.
Okay. I'm sorry. I wanted to play off the eyewitnesses part, because you say that, and I remember you saying that Paul wasn't saw eyewitnesses. I'm just wondering, where do you find in Paul that he actually says somebody was an eyewitness?
Okay, that's time right there, you guys. All right. So now it's John Gleason's turn for 10-minute cross-examination. Jonathan McLatchie.
Oh, okay. I'm sorry. I thought it. My bad. I misunderstood the setup here. I guess I'll just continue with what I was saying. So the eyewitnesses portion. Where in Paul do we find eyewitnesses? Paul explicitly stating eyewitnesses, and the explicitly stating disciples, actually suggesting that they are those things.
Well, for one thing, if Jesus had a brother, then presumably his brother would have to be an eyewitness, right?
Okay, so that's a pretty good one to bring up, but I really don't think that he was mentioning him as his brother.
I'm familiar with Carrier's take on that, but why don't you go ahead and explain why?
Well, I mean, again, it's not just Carrier. There are plenty of other scholars that also support, because, I mean, Carrier's book on the historicity of Jesus is supported by other scholars. There are extensive footnotes in there where he cites other scholars that support him. So I feel like it's very disingenuous to paint it as if it's only Carrier that's saying these things. But regardless of that, so the argument here is about the James, the brother of the Lord. There's a lot of different factors that are in play here. For one thing, the grammar of that particular section doesn't directly suggest that he was a blood brother. Considering that Paul has this idea of brothers and sisters, that once you become a baptized Christian, you become a brother or sister of Jesus, of the Lord, then this brother of the Lord would be a cultic title, and it would be known. And there's several instances in Paul where he references other Christians as being brothers and sisters in Christ or in the Lord. And so unless you think that all of those other ones are actually brothers and sisters of Jesus, which, mind you, one of those particular references calls the wives of apostles sisters. So unless you think that they're actually committing some kind of incest there with their sister, I would think that you would have to acknowledge the fact that this sister-brother thing could be some kind of fraternal deal, like a faith-based kind of brother and sister. The word actually used here is ambiguous as to what it means, because it could both mean a family member of the same faith, like a person in the same faith as them, or an actual family member. So considering that Paul here doesn't actually say that he's like brother of the Lord in the flesh, or even more simply, just the brother of Jesus, I mean, it seems to me that Paul was being ambiguous here, either because people already knew about the brother-sister faith thing, or it, like the term brother in the Lord was being secretly policed or something like that, where it's not actually mentioned anywhere in the evidence. But it seems to me like the easiest conclusion to come to, the one that is the simplest conclusion, is that it's an ambiguous reference, and it does nothing for either case, either historical or ahistorical.
So in Galatians 1, he says, after 3 years I went up to Jerusalem to visit Cephas, and remained with him 15 days, but I saw none of the other apostles except James, the Lord's brother. So he's saying that Sorry?
That's not what the Greek says.
What does it say?
The Greek says brother of the Lord.
Okay. But let me finish my point. So he says that he saw Cephas, who's an apostle, and you remain with him 15 days. But so none of the other apostles except James, the Lord's brother. So he's calling James the brother so as to distinguish him from Peter, who's not the Lord's brother, right? So in this sense,
not his brother, it's that he's not an apostle. James, in that particular sentence, he's just saying that James isn't an apostle.
But Peter presumably would be a brother as well by carrier standards, right?
Well, I mean, in the essence, or in the idea that all Christians were, brothers and sisters of the Lord, but it seems to insinuate here that there's a specific title, the brothers of the Lord or brother of the Lord, as being indicative of just a general baptized Christian, or maybe some other rank and file Christian that wasn't just a general Christian, but was somehow more important to the church, or the early church, but was definitely not an apostle.
So this actually is where there's a bit of inconsistency, I think, in Carrier's position, because in 1 Corinthians 15, so Richard Carrier thinks that the qualification for being an apostle is that you had some sort of visitation by Jesus. I don't know if that's what you take, but that's the view that you take, but that's certainly what Carrier thinks. In 1 Corinthians 15, Paul makes it very clear that Jesus appeared to Cephas and to James. And so if Jesus appeared, so by Carrier's definition, if he's applying the term consistently, he would have to say that James is also an apostle. And so he's then distinguishing, in Galatians 1, then he's now distinguishing James, the brother, from Peter, who's not the brother.
Okay. I guess I don't understand this argument here, how it's an inconsistency. You're talking about James.
Let me explain this a bit better. So Richard Carrier thinks that the qualification for being an apostle was that you had encountered Jesus. Right? He doesn't believe that they physically encountered him, but at least you had a visitation from Jesus, or some sort of hallucination of Jesus, or something like that, a vision of Jesus. And so in 1 Corinthians 15, Paul specifically says that Jesus appeared to James. And so by Carrier's own standards, James, by that definition, would be one of the apostles.
So there was only one James in existence at that point?
But this is a specific James that it's talking about. There's a specific James who is the leader in the Jerusalem church, and so when you single out James and he doesn't include a qualifier or something, then it can be assumed, I think, safely that this is the James that everyone knows about, namely the James, the leader of the Jerusalem church.
Right. So, I mean, he's talking about a different James there. I don't understand why the James in Galatians has to be the same James
in order for your argument to work, you have to assume that, well, he must be talking about a different James here, rather than just the simplest explanation, which is this is the famous James who's the leader of the Jerusalem church. He's an apostle. And so we interpret in Galatians 1 that this James is the same apostle. And when he says he saw none of the other apostles, just James, the Lord's brother, he's using brother there so as to distinguish him from Cephas, who's not the brother of the Lord.
Well, I mean, yeah, he's doing that, but that's also just a different James. I don't see how it being just a different James is a less satisfactory explanation than these have to be the same James. I mean, that to me, that doesn't explain anything. In Galatians 1:19, he's separating out the other Christian that was there and specifying that he was not an apostle. He was just a general Christian, while when he talks about the James later that had a vision of Jesus that was an apostle, he is a different James. I don't see how there's any kind of contradictory thing here. It's just a different.
Notice also in Galatians it uses a definite article. So it's not James, one of the brothers, or a brother of the Lord, but the brother of the Lord.
Well, I mean, that's really just a kind of a semantical argument at that point. I mean, honestly, I don't feel that that's a very strong evidence that he is talking about a blood brother, especially when he uses a word that makes it ambiguous.
Okay. You can continue with your cross-examination, because I think we've gone through that.
Also, you talked about disciples. I know that you consider Cephas a disciple because he's later attested to in the
Right.
Gospels. I'm wondering, where in Paul's writings does he actually say someone is a disciple?
He doesn't, as far as I recall, use the term. He doesn't use the term disciple, but he does speak about the 12. So in 1 Corinthians 15, he says, "For I delivered to you as of first importance what I also received: that Christ died for our sins in accordance with the Scriptures, that he was buried, that he was raised on the third day in accordance with the Scriptures, and he appeared to Cephas, then to the 12." And the correlation of the 12 with the 12 that we read over in the Gospel suggests that this is the disciples that he's talking about. That's just the simplest way of reading that.
Well, I mean, I don't think that's not the simplest way of reading that, because you're actually reading information into the text.
Well, this is how history is done, right? We have different sources and we use them to illuminate one another, and we don't just read them in a vacuum in a chamber, but we actually put sources together and help to clarify one another.
Well, but I mean, it's
and also given
not how history's done, though.
It is how history is done.
No, you don't read information into like like right here, the 12. We're not given any kind of indication as to who the 12 are. Would you agree that 12 is a very famous number in the Bible and the Old Testament and the faith in general?
All right, that's time. That is time. 10 minutes. Time expired. All right, Jonathan, you have 10 minutes to cross-examine Godless Engineer.
Okay. I want to go back to the issue of unexplained illusions, first of all. So let's go to the example I gave in my opening statement, which is in Mark 15. So verse 21, they compelled a passerby, Simon of Cyrene, who was coming in from the country, the father of Alexander and Rufus, to carry his cross. In your rebuttal, you seem to confuse this with undesigned coincidences. They're not the same thing. This is an allusion which is not elaborated upon or explained or further expanded upon in the Gospels. Alexander and Rufus do not show up anywhere in the Gospels apart from here. They're just name dropped. Surely the simplest explanation is that these are real historical people who were known to the original audience, right?
I don't find that to be the simplest thing. How do you discern them being a real person from them just being somebody in a story? I mean, we see stories, fictional stories all the time where you have these supporting characters that are written in that have full names. So I don't understand how you can discern it as being a real person.
The way this is written is as though the audience who's reading it knows who these individuals are. So Simon of Cyrene was compelled to carry the cross. Oh, and he was the father of Alexander and Rufus, right? So the audience presumably knew who these individuals were. We don't. There's no further clarification or explanation as to who these people are.
I don't really think that there needs to be. I mean, they're not important to the story or anything like that. I mean, it really just seems like superfluous information.
But when you're making up a story, you try to minimize unnecessary detail.
I mean, I don't necessarily think that, like, I don't think that that's necessarily something that they were thinking about at the time. And plus, I don't know what the larger goal of including them were. Like, is this an allegory? I've heard that there are some interpretations of it that have it as being some kind of allegory of something else. But I mean, with these kind of characters and with this kind of mention, it seems more like a literary device, or there's something larger at play here than they were just existing in history.
So you see what you're doing. You're doing what the conspiracy theorists do. I mean, your position literally is a conspiracy theory because you have a far-fetched explanation for any evidence that's contrary to your position.
No, I'm not. This is not conspiracy theory like. I mean, saying that this seems more like a literary device than actual history or anything like that, that is known to be not history, is not a conspiracy theory.
Think about what you're saying. I'm giving you an evidence that contradicts your position, namely Alexander and Rufus are just name dropped like the original audience knows who they are, and you're hypothesizing that this is some literary device in order to save your theory. That's classic conspiracy theory behavior.
No, it's not. No, I'm not exhibiting classic. Do you not, if I remember correctly, you argue for creationism, right?
No.
You don't? I thought you did. I'm sorry.
I'm not a young earth creationist.
Oh, okay, cool. I thought that you had said that you had argued for creationism one time. I think on that believable thing, unbelievable.
No, I've been an unbelievable number of times. I've defended intelligent design. I've not defended young Earth creationism.
Oh, okay. So in intelligent design, you defend intelligent design.
Right.
Oh, okay, good. Some would call that a conspiracy theory or some kind of crank idea. So, I mean, I don't really think that you should be, throwing stones at a glass house at this point.
No, I'm saying that conspiracy theorists find a rationalization for any contrary evidence, and it seems this is exactly what you're doing. When they give you evidence from Paul, you try and explain it away with having these far-fetched theories that Paul thought that Jesus was crucified under the moon in outer space by demons, which is the Carrier thesis. Or when I give you this example from Mark, well, this is just a literary device. It seems that it's very far-fetched.
No. Okay. So basically, you're complaining that I have an answer for your objections, and that makes me a conspiracy theorist.
Oh, the conspiracy theorists always have an answer to objections. They're just very far-fetched. They go to great lengths to find the explanation.
Well, yeah, but if I start posing questions to you and you have answers for all of my objections to you, does that not also make you a conspiracy theorist?
Well, if you present me with strong counter evidence to my position and I come up with really far-fetched explanations to try and save my position, then that would be conspiracy theory, yeah.
Okay, I want to know what is far-fetched about a literary device used in a gospel that is not historical, that is copying off of earlier works to create its fictional timeline, its fictional story. How is claiming that is a literary device is a far-fetched idea? I do not understand that at all. It would be different if I was like, well, you know what? Aliens were abducting them, and that's why everybody knew. That right there. Aliens. That's the answer. That's conspiracy theory.
Okay.
Me using a literary device in a literary story that was constructed to teach certain parabolic things for a faith is not a conspiracy-like idea.
So I think at this point the audience can decide who's made the better argument regarding this text. So let's go to a different one.
Okay.
So let's go to the example of an undesigned coincidence I gave, which is in John 12. There's many dozens of these we could get into in the Gospels. This is just one of them that I brought up in my opening statement. So the confirmation of Jesus approaching Bethany 6 days before Passover. What's your explanation of that from a mythicist viewpoint?
I'm sorry. Can you repeat the John passage again?
So 6 days before Passover, Jesus therefore came to Bethany where Lazarus was and Jesus rose from the dead. And I showed that in Mark, we can actually count off the days and arrive at Mark 14, which says exactly where we expect it to be, that it was now 2 days before Passover.
Okay.
And the way you would expect that these are actually true stories.
Well, I don't know. If I actually offer you a explanation that shows that I don't accept your thing, is that going to make me a conspiracy theorist because I have an explanation for it?
Okay, so what is your explanation?
My explanation is that John was writing in the 2nd century, and he had these.
You would date John to the 2nd century? Are you serious?
Yeah, I mean that's.
We have papyri from like 125, 130 AD, which is fragment from the Gospel of John in the 2nd century.
Wait, what? Say that again. I'm sorry.
We have papyri fragment. We have papyri fragments of John from the 2nd century. We have allusions by church fathers to the Gospel of John in the 2nd century. Irenaeus talks about the Gospel of John as scripture in the 2nd century.
Right. I'm not saying it's like middle or late 2nd century. I'm talking about like at the very end of the 1st, early 2nd, like in
it's right at the end of the 1st. Sure, I can accept that. I would date John to 1995 CE, but it certainly isn't 2nd century.
100 AD would be 2nd century.
Right. I don't think it's as late as that. But anyway, that's beside the point. So,
okay, yeah, you're right. It's regardless of the point. My main point is that John was using other gospels in order to generate his gospel, so it would make sense that he would include such things as that.
Except that this is again so subtle and casual that the best explanation is that this is just what happened. I mean, the simplest explanation clearly is that this is an actually historical event, that Jesus really did 6 days before Passover enter Bethany. That is the simplest explanation.
I don't think it's the simplest explanation.
So you think?
Huh?
I mean, and Mark and John also. So Mark telescopes the account such that in Mark 11 he doesn't mention that Jesus actually arrives in Bethany the night before, and in the morning he gets the colt and rides into Jerusalem, and so it doesn't. And so the fact that John splits it doesn't really fit so well with. And also in Mark 13, you have the Olivet Discourse. It doesn't even tell you that it's the evening. You infer it's the evening because she's on the way home for the night from Jerusalem to Bethany. And so the way that it's so casual and subtle, I think, suggests that the best explanation for this is that these are actually historical events that really happened.
Well, I still don't understand why you feel that these are actual historical events, because of the fact that it was written so much later, not by an eyewitness, not by anybody an eyewitness. Hold on. Not by anybody that he knew to be an eyewitness, and he had Mark in which to write off of. So it feels like you're saying that it's more plausible that writers can't add subtle things to their works in order to make it cohere with other books or something like that. I mean, do you think that like the Harry Potter books are independent, or the what's the other one that predates the Harry Potter books, the Monsters one? Either one of those series of books. I mean, those are fictional accounts that would have subtle things worked into them, but that does not make them historical. I feel like the whole hypothesis of, writers being unable to add subtle things to their literary works is far more implausible than it has to be a historical account, especially when you consider all of the other information about these works that place them at a time when they just simply couldn't recount any historical evidence.
Again, you're playing conspiracy theory.
All right, that's time right there. All right, Godless Engineer, it is now your time for a 10-minute cross-examination of Jonathan McLatchie.
Okay. So let's see. We were talking about the 12 disciples. I can't remember where I left off last time. I know I was asking about like where he specifically cites disciples. I don't know if did we answer that?
We did, and I we went to 1 Corinthians 15. We talked about James being an eyewitness because he was a brother of Jesus, and so forth.
Okay, yeah. So, let's see. You talk about the whole being made of flesh. I mean, I've said that it's very possible that or probable that Paul considered Jesus to be made of the Davidic flesh, but just that it existed in the celestial realm. And now, one of the reasons why I think this is because, of course, the ascension of Isaiah, which I do happen to get from Carrier. But I want to know, what do you think about the ascension of Isaiah and how that factors into like Christian ideology?
So yeah, it has quite a rich or complicated textual history. I mean, the first part of the ascension of Isaiah about Jesus was probably written in the late 1st century or early 2nd century CE, and it exists in multiple versions that are written in different languages. And Richard Carrier claims that the ascension of Isaiah teaches that demons killed Jesus while he was just below the moon in outer space. And he also asserts that the Latin version indicates that Jesus was never on earth as a man. But when you actually read the text carefully, the claims that Carrier wants to make regarding the ascension of Isaiah don't seem to me to be so convincing. And in any case, I don't find that I mean, Paul clearly, I think, believed that Jesus was a physical person. So I think that it's neither here nor there. I mean, no version of the ascension of Isaiah says that demons killed Jesus just below the moon. In fact, Jesus does not even give a password to the angels of the air because they are plundering and doing violence to one another. The Latin 2 version and the Slavonic version of the ascension of Isaiah indicate that Jesus was on earth in human form. And Starting when Jesus reaches the fifth heaven, Jesus takes the form of the inhabitants of each realm that he descends into. These verses stating, I quote, and he said to me, they do not receive these until the Son of God first descends. Nevertheless, they know those. They know whose are the thrones and whose the crowns when he descends and is like your form. End quote. So the Son of God becomes like Isaiah's form. In other words, the Son of God becomes like human's form. And so thus, since Jesus takes on human form, it follows that he descended down to the earth. The document explicitly says, and I quote, and I saw one like a son of man, and he dwelt with men in the world, and they did not recognize him. So in other words, Jesus lived with men in the world, which implies that the ascension of Isaiah teaches that Jesus did in fact come to earth.
Okay, well, the earliest redaction of the ascension of Isaiah doesn't actually have the descending to the face of the earth. It has him in the upper heavens, which would be where the devil and his demons reign. But now, if I can kind of switch gears a little bit, because I want to know what your opinion is of Galatians 1:11 through 16. 1:11 through 16. To recite it for people, it says, this is from Paul, and he says, I want you to know, brothers and sisters, that the gospel I preached is not of human origin. I did not receive it from any man, nor was I taught it. Rather, I received it by revelation from Jesus Christ. And he goes on to talk more about that in those particular sections. But I want to know, what is your response to those first two verses there?
So I interpret this as pertaining to when Paul had his Damascus Road conversion experience. He received the gospel personally from Jesus when Jesus appeared to him on the road to Damascus on his way to persecute Christians, as recounted in Acts chapter 9.
Okay, but I mean, Paul explicitly states that he didn't get his information from anybody, like any human.
Receive the gospel from anyone. It doesn't talk about information. In fact, he says he did get information from people because in fact he goes to meet with Cephas and with James to check that the gospel he's been preaching is the same as their gospel. So he does get information from people, and he does consult.
No. If I double check myself against somebody else, is that me getting any information about my information other than it's the same information? He's not actually getting information from these people. He's just confirming that he has the same understanding of the gospel. The gospel would be like this whole history of Christ that you're talking about.
He doesn't say that he got all his biographical information about Jesus from divine revelation. He says, I would have you know,
not biographical information, or would they not be biographical information?
Sorry, say that again. I didn't hear the start of that.
Well, I mean, would the gospel not be biographical information about Jesus if the gospels are like the gospels that we have are indeed,
the Greek word evangelion means good news, and so he's saying, "For I would have you know, brothers, that the good news that was preached to me is not man's gospel. For I did not receive it from any man, nor was I taught it, but I received it through revelation of Jesus Christ." In other words, revelation. That's not, I think, talking about biographical information.
Well, I mean, he's talking about information about Jesus. Is he not? Oh, can you hear me?
Mm-hmm.
Okay. I mean, is he not talking about, like, I mean, he's talking about Jesus, what Jesus taught, Jesus's message. I mean, don't you think Jesus's message would include some kind of indication that of him being on earth?
Yeah. So he received the gospel, which is the good news of salvation, etc., from God. That's what transformed him from being a persecutor of the Christians to being the Apostle Paul.
Well, right.
Receiving the gospel by special revelation. But I don't think that necessarily pertains to biographical information.
Well, like you say that he recounts the Last Supper, right?
Right. So he knew biographical information about Jesus, but I don't think that's necessarily what this text is saying here. I think Galatians 1 is very, very plausibly read that he received the good news of salvation by special revelation, not because a human shared it with him.
I mean, when he talks about like when he talks about that, the Last Supper, I mean, he specifically says that, you know, he got this information from Jesus. I mean, that's the only place that he ever gets his information about Jesus and his message.
So the so First Corinthians. Let's go to 1 Corinthians 11.
23.
Verse 23, I think. So 1 Corinthians 11. He says, verse 23, "For received from the Lord what I also delivered to you, that the Lord Jesus, on the night when he was betrayed, took bread." So here's a quotation from a scholar, Ginter Bornheim. He says, and I quote, "As in 710, in an early tradition derived ultimately from Jesus of Nazareth, and quoted by Paul, is traced by him to the Lord, not in the sense that he has had direct communication from the risen Christ about the supper, but that what he has received as tradition, he now vests with the authority of the risen Christ, the one who was given up to death, but is now the exalted one." And there's many other quotes and commentaries that would take the same line on that, on the interpretation of that.
Well, yeah, but that's not what the actual text says. This is more of reading into the text what you want it to mean, because the actual text says, "For I received from the Lord," meaning he received it from the Lord. I don't know how you can. I don't understand why it's a better explanation that what he actually means here is that he received it from people that received it prior to him that received it from the Lord. Like, that seems to be inserting an extra step here.
I don't think so. I mean, if you read critical commentaries, that's a very standard view of that text.
I mean, a very standard view from Christians, right?
Yeah, at least the ones I've read, yeah.
Okay. So what do you say about all of these references to Paul only getting his information from Revelation, considering, you know, what we just talked about?
Sorry, say that again.
It's not just this one time. He repeatedly says that he only gets his information from scriptures and from Revelation.
Where else does he say that?
Let's see. There's Romans 10:14 through 17.
Okay, let's have a look. Romans 10:14 through 17. So Romans 10:14 through 17 says, "How then will they call on him in whom they have not believed? Now are they to believe in him of whom they have never heard? And how are they to hear without someone preaching? And how are they to preach unless they are sent? And how beautiful are the feet of those who preach the good news. But they have not all obeyed the gospel. Like, for Isaiah says, Lord, who has believed what he has heard from us? So faith comes from hearing, and hearing through the word of Christ." So where does that text support your thesis?
All right, that is time right there. That is time. All right, John McLatchie, you have 10 minutes. Your final 10 minutes to cross-examine John Gleason.
Okay, so let me talk about, let's see, to go to, let's see where I'll go with this. I want to talk about Galatians 4:4. That Paul, in his letter to the Galatians, chapter 4, verse 4, he says that when the fullness had come, God has sent forth his Son, born of woman, born under the law. So Richard Carrier has the theory I got into in the opening statement regarding Galatians 4:4, and he takes this allegorical interpretation of Galatians 4:4 in light of the analogy that Paul draws back to Abraham, Isaac, and Ishmael and Hagar later in the chapter. But that only makes sense if we translate genomenon as born rather than manufactured. And so if Carrier is correct here in this interpretation, then he has himself refuted his own response to Romans 1:3 that genomenon shouldn't be used to refer to a human being born. And what would you say to that?
Well, I mean, I think if you look at Strong's Concordance, it's pretty clear that it's a little ambiguous as to what it means here. And the fact that Paul doesn't only uses this particular verb or whatnot to refer to Jesus's birth, and when you have other other references like Romans 9:11, where he uses a word that more directly states an earthly or natural birth, I think it kind of lends credence to the idea that he's talking about Jesus's body being made or manufactured rather than actually born. And another thing is that this particular portion is considered to be an allegory that he's talking about here. With I believe it's the woman is the the earth or this world or something like that. Just the world of man or something along those lines. So I feel like that's a more plausible explanation for that particular passage rather than looking at it prima facie and only at a surface level.
Right, but you would agree that there is an analogy or allegorical understanding going on in Galatians 4, because he talks about the two seeds of Ishmael and Isaac, and etc. But that analogy only makes sense if we translate it as born. Rather, so if the way that if Kerry wants to relate that Galatians 4:4 passage to that later allegory and interpret the Galatians 4:4 usage of the term genomenon allegorically rather than literally, its connection to the allegory that Paul draws only makes sense if we translate it as born rather than manufactured, which is how Kerry wants to translate it when it comes to Romans 1:3. Does that make sense?
Well, I mean, I understand your argument, but I just fundamentally disagree with how you're interpreting this passage, because when I look at the definitions of the words that Paul uses when referring to Jesus's birth or Jesus's body or coming into being, it's vastly different than when he's talking about other people that go through natural births. So I guess we'll just have to agree to disagree on this particular point.
Okay. Let's see. Where else do I want to go? Let's talk about the rulers of this age in 1 Corinthians 2:7-8. So Paul says, but we impart a secret and hidden wisdom of God, which God decreed before the ages for our glory. None of the rulers of this age understood this, for if they had, they would not have crucified the Lord of glory. And so that text at face value seems to me to indicate that Jesus was crucified on earth by rulers and authorities of his day. How would you understand that?
Well, I would understand that as it actually has it written, and that's that it doesn't talk about the Romans or anybody that was of the earthly plane, I guess. When it says archons of this aeon, most likely he's talking about like devils or demons or whatever. And this is supported by things like 2 Corinthians 4:4 and Ephesians 2:2. Different things like that. 2 Corinthians 4:4, Paul actually calls Satan the god of this age. So it kind of seems like when he says archons of this aeon or rulers of this age, he's actually talking about like the devil or Satan. I mean, Jonathan, wouldn't you agree that the Christian message, at least now, understands that this world, like the worldly existence of people and Christians, I guess, like the ruler of this world is Satan?
Yeah, but the meaning of Greek words is shaped down by context. So we can understand the word in light of its context. So take Romans 13. Take Romans 13, the first 3 verses. Paul says, let every person be subject to the governing authorities, for there is no authority except from God, and those who exist have been instituted by God. Therefore, whoever resists the authorities resists what God has appointed, and those who resist will incur judgment. For rulers, archontes, the same Greek word that's used, are not a terror to good conduct, but to bad. That's clearly a case where archontes refers to human rulers, right? So we can evaluate from the context of 1 Corinthians 2:7-8 whether the word there refers to spiritual forces or to human authorities. So what about the word eon, which is translated age in 1 Corinthians 2:8? So that word can be used in a plain temporal sense. So, for example, in verse 20, 1 Corinthians 1, Paul says, "Where is the one who is wise? Where is the scribe? Where is the debater of this age?" And also in 1 Corinthians 3:18, he says, "Let no one deceive himself. If anyone among you thinks that he is wise in this age, let him become a fool, that he may become wise." So, and one may point out the parallel text in Ephesians 3:9 and 10, where the rulers are identified as the ones in heaven, where it says to bring light for everyone is the plan of the mystery hidden for ages in God, who created all things, so that through the church the manifold wisdom of God might now be made known to the rulers and authorities in heavenly places. And you also mentioned Ephesians 6:12, I think you mentioned Ephesians 6:12. "For we do not wrestle against flesh and blood, but against the rulers, against the authorities, against the cosmic powers over the present darkness, against the spiritual forces of evil in the heavenly places." So the point here, though, is the difference in context between the text of 1 Corinthians and Ephesians, and Paul always uses specific modifying words when he's speaking about spiritual forces. So you always find that he uses these modifying words to clarify that he's speaking about spiritual forces. So let's just talk about for a moment the context of 1 Corinthians 2. So in 1 Corinthians 1:20, he says, "Where is the one who is wise? Where is the scribe? Where is the debater of this age? Has not God made foolish the wisdom of this world?" So he refers to human wisdom, human strength, a human perspective, and things that are foolish, weak, insignificant, despised in the world. And he says his speech was not based on the wisdom of men, and it was not a wisdom of this age or the rulers of this age. And so it's in this context that we arrive at chapter 2, verse 8. "None of the rulers of this age understood this, for if they had, they would not have crucified the Lord of glory." And verse 9 says, "What no eye has seen, nor ear heard, nor the heart of man imagined, what God has prepared for those who love him." And in verse 11, "For who knows a person's thoughts except the spirit of that person who is in him? So also no one comprehends the thoughts of God except the Spirit of God." And in case we still weren't convinced, here are verses 12 through 16, and I'll ask you to comment. So in verses 12 to 16, it says, "Now we have received not the spirit of the world, but the Spirit who is from God, that we might understand the things freely given us by God. And we impart this in words not taught by human wisdom, but taught by the Spirit, interpreting spiritual truths to those who are spiritual. The natural person does not accept the things of the Spirit of God, for they are folly to him, and he is not able to understand them because they are spiritually discerned. The spiritual person judges all things, but is himself to be judged by no one. For who has understood the mind of the Lord so as to instruct him? But we have the mind of Christ." And so it seems to me inescapable that the rulers being spoken of here are indeed human rulers, not demonic or spiritual forces. How would you respond to that?
Well, I feel like you broke down the rulers of this age in a way that, is like breaking down the title President of the United States. There are a lot of presidents out there, whether it be companies or anything like that. And United States, you could be referencing any number of topics with that. But it's the rulers of this age that we're kind of looking at. So breaking it apart like that, I didn't really feel
reading it contextually. Is reading it contextually.
Well, I understand you're reading this contextually, but I'm saying that the contexts were different, and breaking it apart like that, like pointing out that ruler or the word for ruler is used in other places to reference, earthly rulers or whatnot. That's a lot like using president to reference a president of a company rather than the president of the United States. And you just assume people know you're talking about some kind of company. I'm just saying that the ruler can be used to denote earthly rulers. I agree. And then the whole age bit can be used in different ways too. But I would also like to ask, which I know a lot of this has been brought up between you and Carrier in your previous debate. I just wanted. Oh,
all right, that is time. All right, it's your turn. It's your turn, Lisa. Go ahead. Go for your final 10-minute cross-examine of Jonathan McLatchie.
Okay.
Okay. Sorry, who's cross-examining now?
This is John's Godless Engineer's last final time.
Okay, cool.
So I guess I'll start off where we just left off with the Archons as Aeon. So I would really want to look at the context of the rulers of this age, that particular section, because like what does can you tell me the motivation for like having to hide Jesus, like in his death or whatnot, from the Romans or even the Jews? Like, what is the purpose of like if Jesus's like identity as Son of God had been believed by everybody at that time, you know, what's the point in keeping that hidden from them? Like, if they would have known, they wouldn't have killed him. But the entire purpose of it is so that Jesus can absolve sins. So wouldn't they want to, if they are all turned by Jesus, wouldn't they want to have their sins absolved? Like, the death of Jesus is this climax to the whole original sin thing where Jesus takes on this sin. So if they believe Jesus's message, then wouldn't they, I mean, I don't see the motivation there for them to, you know, for Jesus's identity to be hidden from them.
So you're referring to 1 Corinthians 2 from verse 6. It says, "Yet among the mature we do impart wisdom, though it's not a wisdom of this age, or the rulers of this age who are doomed to pass away. But we impart a secret and hidden wisdom of God, which God decreed before the ages for our glory. None of the rulers of this age understood this, for if they had, they would not have crucified the Lord of glory." In other words, they had no idea who Jesus was. They had no idea that he was God incarnate. They had no idea that he was God's Messiah that was promised long ago through the prophets. And so if they had known that, they wouldn't have crucified the Lord of glory. That's, I think, the most simple and plain reading of the text.
Well, yeah, but I mean, what I guess I just don't understand the motivation to keep it hidden from them. I mean, are you saying that
So it says, "We impart a secret and hidden wisdom of God, which God decreed before the ages for our glory." And then it moves on to talk about the rulers of this age. It says, "None of the rulers of this age understood this." In other words, they didn't understand that Jesus is the Jewish Messiah who's long ago foretold by the prophets. For if they had known that, they would not have crucified the Lord of glory.
Well, right. So what I'm saying is like, what I guess I don't understand the motivation for like if they had known that Jesus was the Son of God and everybody believed, isn't that kind of the point? Or is the point more of Jesus being crucified? Like, Jesus had to be crucified one way or another.
Sir, I'm still understanding your point. I think you're reading into the text. It simply says that they didn't understand this. In other words, they didn't understand Jesus is the Jewish Messiah. And if they had known that, they wouldn't have crucified the Lord of glory. Anything beyond that is just reading into it.
Well, right. I guess my point is that being that Jesus was sent down to the earth, or at least in the current view, to defeat Satan, right? I mean, we can agree that that was kind of Jesus's point, right?
Right.
Right. He's there to defeat Satan. So I feel like, on my view, the mythicist view of him being crucified or killed in the celestial realm, if Satan had known that killing Jesus would have defeated him, then they wouldn't have killed him. So there's motivation there for Satan not to kill him. But I don't see the same motivation for the Romans or the Jews on earth. Like,
we know from the Gospels and also elsewhere in Paul that that from the biblical perspective, God, there are people who from whom the gospel is hidden. So when Jesus, for example, is asked, "Why do you speak in parables?" he says, "The secrets of the kingdom of God are made known to you, but not to them." Right. So we know independently that is a concept that we find both in the Gospels and also in Paul's letters as well. But I pointed out that in verse 12 to 16, which lead up to, verse 12 to 16, which follow this, also continue to talk about further support. This is speaking about human authority. So it says, "Now we receive not the spirit of the world, but the Spirit who is from God, that we may understand the things freely given us by God. And we impart this in words not taught by human wisdom, but taught by the Spirit, interpreting spiritual to those who are spiritual. The natural person does not accept the things of the Spirit of God, for they are folly to him, and he is not able to understand them because they're spiritually discerned. The spiritual person judges all things, but is himself to be judged by no one. For who has understood the mind of the Lord so as to instruct him? But we have the mind of Christ." So it goes on to talk about how that the natural person who's not indwelt by the Spirit does not accept the things of the Spirit of God. So it continues to speak about people, it's persons. It's not speaking, I think, primarily here about demons.
Okay.
Spiritual forces.
If I can switch gears a little bit here, are you familiar with Ignatius of Antioch?
Oh yeah, I've read all of his letters. Yeah. Mm-hmm.
Okay. Well, in I believe it's called chapter. It's chapter what 14. He starts out with
which book? I mean, he wrote 7 letters. Which book is it in?
Oh, crap. I did not write that down.
If you say the passage, I might know that already.
Right. So he says, now the virginity of Mary was hidden from the prince of this world, as was also her offspring and the death of the Lord. 3 mysteries of renown which were wrought in silence by God. How then was he manifested to the world? A star shone forth in heaven above all the other stars, the light of which was inexpressible, while its novelty struck men with astonishment. And it goes on and on and on about it. But basically, this right here, Ignatius of Antioch is regurgitating a gospel that we don't even know, because he's saying that Mary, her virginity, Jesus and his suffering, his death, and all of that was done in silence. Nobody knew about it whatsoever until he manifested through a star being shown in the heaven. So, I mean, how do you explain that on historicity?
Right. So this is his letter to the Ephesians, and he says Mary's virginity was hidden from the prince of this world, and I would argue that is the devil or Satan. So was her childbearing, and so was the death of the Lord. All these 3 trump secrets were brought to pass in deep silence of God. And so, yeah, this here is speaking about the demonic realm. I don't contest that, but the question is, what is Paul referring to in 1 Corinthians 1 in particular? And I think in 1 Corinthians 2, and I think from the context, the primary referent in 1 Corinthians 2 is humans. Those in authority, the governing authorities who were responsible for putting Jesus to death, both the Jewish and Roman authorities, the high priest, Caiaphas, Pilate, etc.
Okay, well, I mean, I wasn't directly relating it to the archons of this aeon. I was just wondering what your take was on that particular, I guess, version of the gospel, with the fact that it says that his suffering and everything like that was done in silence, and he wasn't revealed to the world until after his death.
I think they're talking about so the evil forces didn't understand the prophecies in the Old Testament that pointed to the gospel. I'm not quite sure the connection you're trying to draw with this.
Well, I mean, the connection that I'm trying to draw is that even early church fathers or whatnot, like Ignatius, knew of a gospel where the actual earthly existence of Jesus was unknown to people. And then it wasn't until he was revealed to the world, just like what Paul says, where he was revealed, like the gospel of Jesus was revealed to him by God, by the Lord, by Jesus.
So are you saying that Ignatius didn't believe that Jesus lived physically on earth?
I'm not necessarily saying that. I'm saying that Jesus's existence was unknown to anybody until he was revealed after his death.
No, I think it's talking about the gospel, which wasn't known until after his death, or it wasn't the significance of the true significance of the cross. It wasn't known until after the resurrection by the majority of people. I think that's what it's getting at, and the demonic realm. I think that's what it's getting at.
I mean, do you like when you read that, you literally read all of that?
That's the way I've always understood this. Yeah, I've read this text many times.
Okay, well, you have to understand. When I read it, huh?
I mean, he says just the section immediately prior to this text that you quoted. He says, "As for me, my spirit is now a humble devotion to the cross, The cross, of course, is a Roman emblem of execution. The cross which so greatly offends the unbelievers, but is salvation and eternal life to us. Where is your wise man now, or your subtle debater? Where are the fine words of our so-called intellectuals? Under the divine dispensation, Jesus Christ, our God, was conceived by Mary of the seed of David and of the Spirit of God. He was born and he submitted to baptism so that by his passion he might sanctify water. So he's baptized, which involves water, and he's born and he's a descendant of David. I mean, it all seems to point towards him being a physical person who lived on earth and walked.
All right.
Sorry, go ahead.
All right, that concludes the cross-examination portion of this debate.